You will regret the day you ever crossed me, she shrieked, her face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief. I will own this house. I will destroy you. It was a satisfyingly hollow threat, especially since her hands were cuffed behind her back and 2 detectives were escorting her out of the community center. Even more satisfying was the subtle, yet unmistakable, stench of raw sewage that had just begun to waft in from her perfectly manicured front lawn across the street. Poetic justice, I believe they call it. I never wanted a war. When my wife, Sarah, passed away, all I wanted was quiet. Our life together had been loud and full of joy, but her illness had been a long, draining siege. When it was over, the silence in our old house was deafening, each room a museum of memories I wasn't ready to face. Her parents had left us their home in this sleepy, manicured subdivision called Willow Creek Estates, and after 6 months of rattling around in my own personal ghost town, moving there seemed like the only logical step. It was a chance to build a new, quieter life for myself and my teenage son, Mark. A place to heal. The house was smaller, more manageable, but the yard was its true soul. Sarah's mother had been a master gardener, and Sarah had inherited that gift. The backyard was a sanctuary, a carefully cultivated paradise of flowering bushes, stone pathways, and at its heart, a magnificent Japanese maple that Sarah had planted with her father when she was a girl. Its delicate, blood-red leaves were a living monument to the family I had married into, and now, the family I had lost. I'm a structural engineer by trade. I deal in concrete, steel, and load-bearing capacities. Plants were Sarah's domain, but I found a strange peace in trying to maintain her legacy, a way to feel close to her. Willow Creek Estates was governed by a homeowners association, a fact I barely registered when I moved in. I'm a rule follower by nature. My lawns are mowed, my trash cans are put away, I don't cause trouble. I figured the HOA and I would have a perfectly boring, non-existent relationship. I was wrong. My introduction to the iron-fisted ruler of our little fiefdom came about a week after I'd settled in. Her name was Brenda. She was the HOA president, a woman in her late 50s who carried herself with the unearned authority of a tin-pot dictator. She drove a gleaming white SUV that was always parked slightly askew, taking up just a little too much space, a perfect metaphor for her personality. I was in the backyard, wrestling with a new sprinkler head, when I felt a shadow fall over me. I looked up to see her standing on the edge of my lawn, clipboard in hand, her mouth set in a thin, disapproving line. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. It wasn't a greeting, it was an accusation. "Just Frank is fine," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans and standing up. She didn't acknowledge this. Her eyes scanned my property like a hawk searching for a field mouse. They landed on a small, neat stack of firewood I had placed on the concrete patio by the back door, ready for the fire pit. "That," she declared, pointing a perfectly manicured finger, "is a violation." I blinked. "The firewood. It is an unapproved, external structure," she said, as if reciting scripture. "It is also an eyesore and attracts vermin. You have 48 hours to remove it, or you will be issued a fine of $50, escalating daily." I looked at the woodpile. It was maybe 3 feet high and 4 feet long, stacked as neatly as my engineering mind could make it. It was tucked away in a corner, barely visible from the street. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my tone reasonable. "I read the bylaws before I moved in. I don't recall anything about firewood." A flash of irritation crossed her face. She clearly wasn't used to being questioned. "The bylaws grant the Architectural Review Committee, of which I am the head, broad discretion to maintain the aesthetic harmony of the community. That pile of wood is disharmonious. Remove it." Without another word, she turned and marched away, her clipboard held like a scepter. I stood there for a long moment, a strange mix of annoyed and amused. It was absurd. It was petty. But I was new here, and I just wanted peace. I sighed, walked over to the woodpile, and started moving it into the garage. It was easier to comply than to fight. That was my first mistake. It taught her that I was a pushover. It was a lesson she would take to heart, and a mistake I would spend the next several months paying for. The firewood was just the opening salvo in what would become Brenda's personal crusade against me. A week later, a notice appeared on my door. A $50 fine for improper lawn maintenance I had mowed 2 days prior. I got out a ruler. The grass was, in some spots, a quarter of an inch over the 3-inch maximum stipulated in the covenants. It was insane. I paid the fine. Then came the complaint about my truck. My Ford F-150, my personal vehicle for the last 10 years, was suddenly deemed a commercial vehicle because it had a toolbox in the bed. Another $100 fine and a demand that I park it in the garage. The garage where the disharmonious firewood was now stored. I started parking on the street, just outside the HOA's official boundary, which meant a longer walk with groceries, but it was worth it to avoid the hassle. Brenda seemed to take this as a personal affront, a clever circumvention of her authority. Her harassment escalated. She would walk her yapping little dog along the edge of my property line, peering into my yard, making notes on her ever-present clipboard. She started talking to my neighbors, her voice just loud enough to carry. I'd hear snippets of, "New element, doesn't respect the rules, bringing down property values." Most of the neighbors were polite but distant. They had seen this show before. They knew Brenda was a tyrant, but they also knew it was easier to keep your head down and your lawn immaculate than to become her next target. I was the new target. The fresh meat. I tried reasoning with her once more. I went to a monthly HOA meeting, held in the sterile, beige community center. I waited patiently through discussions about seasonal flower arrangements and the resurfacing of the tennis courts. When the floor was open for new business, I stood up. "My name is Frank Miller, at 112 Arbor Lane," I began, my voice calm and even. "I've received a series of fines over the past month that I believe are unwarranted, and I'd like to appeal them to the board." Brenda, sitting at the head of the table, gave me a thin, reptilian smile. "Mr. Miller, all fines are issued in accordance with the community bylaws. If you have violated the rules, you must pay the consequences. This is not a forum for litigating your personal disagreements." "With all due respect," I said, "the rules are being applied in a selective and, frankly, vindictive manner. A quarter-inch of grass height. A toolbox in a pickup truck. This feels less like maintaining community standards and more like personal harassment." The air in the room grew thick. The other 4 board members, a collection of meek-looking retirees, stared down at their papers, refusing to make eye contact. They were her puppets, and everyone knew it. Brenda's smile vanished. "Are you accusing me of malfeasance, Mr. Miller? You, who have been here less than 2 months? You come into our beautiful, well-run community and immediately think you can disregard the rules that everyone else happily follows." "I'm not disregarding the rules," I countered. "I'm questioning your interpretation and application of them. I'm asking for fairness." "Your request is noted and denied," she snapped, banging a small gavel on the table. "Next item." I sat down, my face burning with a frustration I hadn't felt in years. I saw a few sympathetic glances from other homeowners in the audience, but no one spoke up. They were too afraid. I realized then that reason and logic were useless here. Brenda wasn't interested in rules, she was interested in power. And I had challenged hers. The war had been declared, whether I wanted it or not. The peace and quiet I had moved here to find had evaporated, replaced by a constant, low-grade anxiety. Every time I stepped outside, I felt her eyes on me. Every car that drove slowly past my house felt like a spy. It was an untenable way to live. But the true turning point, the moment the conflict went from a frustrating annoyance to a cold, existential battle, was about the tree. Sarah's Japanese maple. It was a Saturday morning in early autumn. The leaves on the maple had turned a shade of crimson so deep and vibrant it looked like the tree was on fire. I was out back, drinking my coffee, trying to soak in a few moments of peace before the day began. Brenda's voice cut through the morning air like a shard of glass. "That tree is a menace." I turned. She was standing at the property line, her arms crossed, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. She looked like she had finally found the perfect weapon to use against me. "It's a beautiful tree," I said, my voice tight. "Its roots," she said, ignoring me, "are invasive. They are undoubtedly encroaching on the common area and threatening the integrity of the community sprinkler system." I was a structural engineer, not an arborist, but I knew that was nonsense. Japanese maples have non-invasive, shallow root systems. The common area she was referring to was a 10-foot wide strip of grass behind my property, and the nearest sprinkler head was a good 20 feet from the tree's trunk. "The roots are not a problem," I said flatly. I have determined that they are, she replied, her voice filled with an unassailable certainty. As such, the tree constitutes a violation of Section 84 of the bylaws, pertaining to landscaping that infringes upon common property. You have 30 days to have it professionally removed. My blood ran cold. I felt a surge of protective fury that startled me. That tree wasn't just landscaping. It was Sarah. It was her memory, her legacy. It was the last living thing her hands had planted and nurtured in this yard. The idea of cutting it down felt like a physical violation, like losing her all over again. No, I said. The word came out quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as granite. Brenda's eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon. I said no, I repeated, my voice gaining strength. I am not cutting down the tree. It is not in violation, and you have no authority to demand it. I have every authority, she hissed. I am the president of this association. If you do not remove it, I will have it removed, and I will bill you for the cost, along with all applicable fines. You will not set foot on my property, Brenda, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone I hadn't used in a very long time. And you will not touch that tree. Are we clear? For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than arrogance in her eyes. It might have been surprise, or maybe even a sliver of fear. She wasn't used to this kind of direct, absolute resistance. She stared at me for a moment, then spun on her heel and stormed off. I stood there for a long time, my coffee forgotten, my heart pounding in my chest. The line had been drawn. This was no longer about firewood or the length of my grass. This was about something sacred. She had threatened a piece of my wife's soul, and in doing so, she had awakened something in me. The part of me that had been dormant since Sarah's death, the part that knew how to analyze a problem, identify structural weaknesses, and bring a faulty system crashing down. The patient, peace-seeking man who had moved to Willow Creek was gone. In his place stood an engineer. And I was about to make Brenda's life my next project. My first step wasn't retaliation, it was reconnaissance. Anger is a poor building material, but data is a foundation you can build on. I spent the next week in a deep dive, treating the HOA and Brenda herself as a complex system with potential points of failure. My evenings were no longer for quiet grieving, they were for methodical investigation. I started with the county clerk's office online portal. I pulled the plat maps for our entire subdivision, the original deeds, and the recorded covenants and restrictions. I printed them all out, spreading them across my dining room table, which quickly transformed into a war room. I traced property lines with a red pen, highlighted utility easements in yellow, and cross-referenced every clause in the bylaws with the official public record. As I suspected, Brenda's claim about the tree's roots was baseless. My property line extended a full 15 feet beyond the tree, and the common area sprinkler system was nowhere near it. Her threat was a complete fabrication, an abuse of power built on a foundation of lies. That was good to know. It was ammunition. Next, I focused on the HOA itself. I requested copies of the meeting minutes for the last 5 years, along with the annual budgets. Brenda couldn't legally deny the request from a homeowner, but she made it as difficult as possible, providing a disorganized stack of papers filled with vague line items and sloppy accounting. It was meant to be intimidating, a data dump designed to be overwhelming. To an engineer, it was a treasure map. I spent nights with a calculator and a spreadsheet, inputting every number. A pattern began to emerge. The landscaping and maintenance budget was wildly inflated, consistently coming in at tens of thousands of dollars more per year than comparable HOAs. The payments were always made to the same company, Prestige Property Management. A quick search of the state's business registry showed that Prestige was a sole proprietorship. Another search on social media revealed the proprietor, a man named Gary, whose sister was none other than Brenda. He was her brother-in-law. It was a classic small-time grift. Brenda would approve massive, vaguely defined projects. Gary would submit inflated invoices. Brenda would cut the checks from the HOA's funds. They were using our dues to line their own pockets. It was fraud, plain and simple. This was more than just a weakness, this was a kill shot. But I needed more than just a spreadsheet. I needed undeniable proof. My final step in the initial investigation was physical surveillance. I wasn't going to let her touch that tree. I ordered a set of high-definition, night vision security cameras online. They were discreet, easy to install, and connected to a cloud-based server. I spent an afternoon placing them strategically around my property, one focused on the Japanese maple, one on my front door, and one with a wide view of the street, including the front of Brenda's house. I was building a web of digital eyes. Every violation notice, every passive-aggressive comment, every late-night prowl of her dog would now be documented, time-stamped, and saved. I also reached out to an old friend, Dave. He was a retired police detective, a man who had spent 30 years navigating the murky waters of evidence and procedure. I laid out the whole situation for him over a beer. He listened patiently, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Classic bully, Frank," he said when I was done. "They run on intimidation and bluff. The moment you stand up to them with actual facts, they crumble. But you gotta do it right." "That's why I'm talking to you," I said. "Document everything," he advised, his voice turning serious. "Every interaction, every notice, every email. Keep a log. Your cameras are a great start, but make sure the date and time stamps are accurate. And with this financial stuff, you're in a different league. That's not just HOA nonsense, that's a felony. You need to be careful. People get desperate when you threaten their cash flow." His words were sobering. I had started this to protect a tree, but I had stumbled into something much bigger. Brenda wasn't just a power-tripping busybody, she was a criminal. And criminals, when cornered, are dangerous. My investigation also yielded one more critical piece of information, almost by accident. While studying the detailed utility plat maps, I was tracing the sewer and water lines for the neighborhood. It was a habit from my job, understanding the hidden infrastructure of a place. I noticed something odd about Brenda's property, which sat on a slight incline directly above mine. The plans showed the location of her septic tank and the layout of its leach field. But there was also a secondary access point marked, a clean-out valve, located unusually close to our shared property line, tucked away behind a dense row of hedges. It was an anomaly in the design, probably a modification made after the initial construction. I filed that little bit of data away. I didn't know how, or if, I would ever use it. But my engineering mind cataloged it nonetheless. A potential access point. A potential vulnerability. With my foundation of data laid, I began to formulate a plan. It wouldn't be a quick, angry outburst. It would be a controlled demolition. I would let Brenda continue her harassment, let her dig her own grave deeper and deeper, all while my cameras recorded her every move. I would bait her, using her obsession with the tree as the lure. And when the time was right, I would use the evidence of her financial crimes to bring the whole rotten structure down. The plan had to be elegant. It had to be precise. And most of all, it had to deliver a sense of poetic justice that was as undeniable as the laws of physics. She wanted to use the earth to destroy something I loved. So, I decided, I would use the earth to return the favor. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the rat to take the bait. I didn't have to wait long. Brenda, emboldened by my silence since our confrontation over the tree, seemed to believe she had won. Her campaign of petty tyranny intensified, as if to punish me for my insubordination. I received fines for having my garden hose coiled, in a non-uniform manner, for a barely visible crack in my driveway's concrete, and for my son leaving his basketball in the yard for 2 hours. I paid none of them. Instead, I photographed each notice, logged it in my file, and sent a polite, registered letter to the HOA board stating that I was formally disputing the fines and would not be paying them until a formal, public appeals hearing was conducted, as was my right under the bylaws. I now knew better than she did. Her response was to escalate from paper to direct action. One morning, I woke up to find 2 of my tires slashed. There was no direct proof it was her, of course. The camera facing the street didn't quite catch the act, only a hooded figure walking away in the pre-dawn darkness. But I knew. Dave, my cop friend, told me it was circumstantial at best, but it was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building. It showed a pattern of escalating harassment. The real bait, however, remained the tree. I knew her obsession with it was the key. She saw it as a symbol of my defiance. To her, its destruction would be the ultimate victory. So, I decided to give her the opportunity. I installed a series of soil moisture sensors around the base of the maple, the kind used for high-tech irrigation systems. They were small, wireless, and fed data directly to an app on my phone. I could monitor the ground saturation in real time. I also made a point of doing some very visible landscaping work in my backyard, near the property line I shared with Brenda. I dug a shallow trench, supposedly for a new French drain system to improve drainage away from the house. It gave me the perfect excuse to be working with pipes, soil, and tools in the exact area I needed to be. It also allowed me to subtly observe the strange clean-out access for her septic system, which was, as the plans indicated, hidden behind a thick forsythia bush just on her side of the line. For a few weeks, nothing happened. The moisture readings remained stable. Brenda seemed content to wage her war of 1,000 paper cuts. Then, we got a week of heavy autumn rain. The ground became thoroughly saturated. It was the perfect condition for what I suspected she was planning. Waterlogged soil can't absorb more water, and it can lead to root rot, a slow, quiet way to kill a tree that would be difficult to prove as malicious. On the third night after the rain stopped, just after 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed. It was the alert from the moisture sensors. The saturation level at the base of the Japanese maple was spiking, rising at an unnatural rate. I didn't move. I just lay in bed, my heart thumping a steady, cold rhythm. I pulled up the live feed from the camera pointed at the tree. And there she was. Brenda, dressed in dark clothing, was creeping across my lawn like a villain from a cheap spy movie. She had a long garden hose, dragged all the way from her own house, and she was holding the nozzle at the base of the tree's trunk, flooding the ground with a steady stream of water. The camera's night vision captured every detail, the grim determination on her face, the way she methodically moved the water stream to soak every inch of the root ball. It was damning. It was perfect. She was so focused on her task that she failed to account for 2 things. First, my property has a slight, almost imperceptible grade, sloping down towards the back of my house. Second, the ground was already as saturated as a sponge in a bucket of water. The excess water she was pumping onto the soil had nowhere to go. It began to pool and then, following the gentle slope of the lawn, it started to flow. It streamed directly towards the foundation of my house and right into the window well of my basement office. I watched on the camera feed as the window well filled up like a bathtub. I saw the water pressure build against the glass until the seal inevitably gave way. Even through the monitor, I could almost hear the sickening gush as gallons of water poured into my basement. She had done it. In her single-minded quest to destroy my most cherished memory of my wife, she had actively, willfully, and now, verifiably, flooded my home. She stayed for another 10 minutes, ensuring the ground was a complete quagmire, before reeling in her hose and slinking back to her house, oblivious to the greater damage she had caused. The moment she was gone, I went into action. I saved and backed up the video footage to 3 separate locations, my computer, a physical hard drive, and the secure cloud server. Then I went down to the basement. It was worse than I thought. A good 2 inches of water covered the entire floor. Boxes of old books and photos, Sarah's things I hadn't been able to sort through yet, were soaked. A wave of hot, furious grief washed over me, but I shoved it down. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. This was a crime scene. I spent the next hour taking hundreds of photos, documenting the damage from every angle. At 4 a.m., I called my insurance company's 24-hour emergency line and filed a claim for water damage. Then, at 7 a.m., I filed a report with the local police for vandalism and destruction of property. I handed the responding officer a flash drive containing the crystal-clear video of Brenda flooding my yard and, consequently, my basement. The officer's eyebrows shot up as he watched the footage on his laptop. "Well," he said, shaking his head. "You don't see that every day." My next move was to formalize the attack within the HOA. I composed a carefully worded letter, addressed to the 4 other members of the board of directors. I detailed the ongoing campaign of harassment, the baseless fines, and the threats against my tree. And then I described the events of the previous night. I included a link to the video evidence and a copy of the police report number. I ended the letter with a simple, direct demand that Brenda be immediately removed as president of the Association for Malfeasance and Willful Destruction of a Homeowner's Property, and that the HOA's insurance cover all damages not paid for by my own. I sent it via certified mail, requiring a signature from each board member. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The board, who had been content to be Brenda's docile flock, was thrown into a panic. They were now accessories to a potential lawsuit and a criminal investigation. They called an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed. Word had spread like wildfire. For the first time, the room was buzzing not with mundane chatter about landscaping, but with genuine tension and drama. I sat in the front row, calm and silent. Brenda marched in, her face pale but set with a defiant rage. She took her seat at the head of the table and banged the gavel. This meeting has been called to address a series of slanderous and baseless allegations made against me by Mr. Frank Miller, she began, her voice shaking with fury. He has fabricated evidence to harass me, in retaliation for my enforcement of our community's rules. One of the board members, a nervous-looking man named Arthur, cleared his throat. Brenda, we've all seen the video. It's fake, she shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. It's a deep fake. He's an engineer, he knows how to do these things. He flooded his own basement to frame me. The accusation was so ludicrous that a murmur of disbelief rippled through the audience. Her carefully constructed facade of control was cracking, revealing the raw, unhinged desperation beneath. She was losing the crowd. Her social credibility, the only real currency she had, was evaporating before her eyes. She pointed a trembling finger at me. He is the problem here. He has been a disruptive influence since the day he moved in, and I will not be intimidated by his lies and his little video tricks. She tried to regain control, to steer the meeting back to her agenda, but it was too late. The other board members were whispering amongst themselves, casting fearful glances in my direction. The homeowners were openly talking, sharing the video on their phones. The trap had sprung beautifully. She was exposed, humiliated, and cornered. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the first reveal. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous. And I knew her retaliation would be swift, vicious, and aimed at the place she knew would hurt me the most, my family. I was ready for it. The demolition was only just beginning. Brenda's public humiliation at the meeting did not chasten her, it radicalized her. Her power base within the HOA was shattered. The board, terrified of legal repercussions, had voted to suspend her presidency pending the outcome of the police investigation. She was stripped of her title, her clipboard rendered meaningless. For a woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in that petty authority, it was a fate worse than death. And she blamed me for all of it. Her retaliation was no longer about fines or passive-aggressive comments. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to ruin my life. The first attack came via the community Facebook group. A new, anonymous profile appeared, posting long, rambling diatribes about me. It accused me of being a neighborhood predator, of having strange late-night visitors, and of using my security cameras to spy on my neighbors. The posts were filled with lies and innuendo, carefully crafted to be damaging but hard to legally disprove. It was a classic smear campaign, and it was effective. I saw neighbors who had previously offered sympathetic smiles now averting their eyes when I walked to my mailbox. The poison was spreading. The next attack was far more insidious and terrifying. It came in the form of two grim-faced social workers from Child Protective Services standing on my doorstep. "We've received an anonymous report," the woman said, her voice professional but devoid of warmth, "alleging child neglect and an unsafe living environment for your son, Mark." My blood turned to ice. Mark was my world, the only piece of Sarah I had left. The idea of anyone threatening that connection filled me with a primal fear I hadn't known was possible. I let them in, my mind racing. They inspected the house, which was clean and well kept. They looked in the fridge, which was full. They spoke to Mark alone in his room for nearly an hour. It was the longest hour of my life. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling, feeling utterly powerless. This was Brenda's work, I knew it with absolute certainty. She had found my greatest vulnerability and struck at it with savage precision. Mark came out of his room looking shaken but resolute. He was a good kid, smart and level-headed. He told them the truth, that I was a good father, that he felt safe and loved. After another 30 minutes of questioning me, the social workers finally left, stating that the claim appeared to be unfounded and likely malicious. They closed the case. but the damage was done. They had invaded my home, questioned my son, and cast a shadow of suspicion over my family. Brenda had crossed a line from which there was no return. The part of me that had still felt a sliver of pity for this pathetic, power-hungry woman died that afternoon. All that remained was a cold, hard resolve. She hadn't just tried to kill a tree, she had tried to take my son. Now, I wasn't just going to win. I was going to annihilate her. The CPS attack, as vicious as it was, gave me the final piece of motivation I needed. It was time to deploy the kill shot, the financial fraud. I had the spreadsheets and the suspicious invoices, but I needed something more. I needed a human source. I needed a whistleblower. My first thought was to approach Brenda's brother-in-law, Gary, the owner of the landscaping company. But he was a co-conspirator, he had too much to lose. He would lawyer up and deny everything. I needed someone on the inside, someone who had been wronged by Brenda and might be willing to talk. I went back through the HOA meeting minutes I had collected. I noticed that about 2 years ago, a long-serving board treasurer named Carol had abruptly resigned. The official reason cited was personal health issues, but I had seen Carol around the neighborhood. She was a spry woman in her late 60s who walked her golden retriever every morning, rain or shine. She didn't look like she had any health issues. I decided to take a chance. I caught up with her during her morning walk the next day. "Carol, my name is Frank Miller," I said, offering a friendly smile. She eyed me cautiously. "I know who you are. You're the one giving Brenda such a headache." There was a hint of admiration in her voice. "I was hoping I could talk to you about her," I said. "Specifically, about your time as the board's treasurer." Her face clouded over. "That was a long time ago. I'd rather not dredge it up." "I know she forced you out," I said gently. "I also know it wasn't because of your health. I think it was because you started asking questions about the landscaping budget." Carol stopped walking and stared at me, her eyes wide with surprise. "How did you know that?" "I'm an engineer," I said. "I look at numbers, and the numbers don't add up. I know she's been paying her brother-in-law's company for work that was never done. I have the budgets and the invoices. What I don't have is the final piece of proof." "I think you do." We stood there on the sidewalk for a long moment. I could see the internal conflict on her face, the fear of getting involved versus the desire for justice. "She's a vindictive woman, Frank," Carol said, her voice low. "You've seen what she does to people who cross her." "I have," I said, my voice hardening. "Yesterday, she called Child Protective Services on my son." Carol gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That was the tipping point. The thought of Brenda weaponizing the state against a child, a grieving widower's son, was too much. "Meet me at my house in an hour," she said, her voice firm. "There's something you need to see." An hour later, I was sitting at Carol's dining room table. She placed a dusty shoebox in front of me. Inside were her old treasury records, copies of checks, and a small, black ledger. "Brenda was always sloppy," Carol explained, her finger tracing a line in the ledger. "She'd have Gary submit an invoice for, say, $10,000 for spring planting. She'd write the check from the HOA account. But then Gary would kick back $2,000 to her, in cash. She thought she was being clever, but I saw the pattern. The invoices were always for round numbers, always just under the amount that would require a second board signature. I started keeping my own records." She pulled out a series of deposit slips from her own bank account. "This is the smoking gun," she said. A few times, she got really arrogant. She had Gary write the kickback check directly to her, and she'd ask me to deposit it along with other HOA checks, hoping I wouldn't notice the different payee. She'd say it was a reimbursement. I knew it was bogus, so I made copies before I deposited them. There it was. Copies of checks from the landscaping company, made out directly to Brenda, for thousands of dollars. It was undeniable proof of embezzlement. It was beautiful. "This is it, Carol," I said, my voice filled with a grim satisfaction. "This is everything." "What are you going to do?" she asked, a nervous tremor in her voice. "I'm going to end this," I said. "For good." The next morning, I walked into the district attorney's office. I had a meeting with an investigator in the economic crimes unit. I laid out the entire story, starting with the firewood and ending with the copies of the embezzled checks. I provided him with a thick binder containing everything: the violation notices, the registered letters, a hard drive with all the camera footage, the HOA financial statements, my spreadsheets, and Carol's damning evidence. The investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Detective Garcia, listened intently, his expression growing more and more serious. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Mr. Miller," he said, "you've done about 90% of my job for me. This is one of the most well-documented cases of small-scale fraud I've ever seen. And the harassment, the property damage, the false CPS report, she's a real piece of work. So you'll take the case?" I asked. "Oh, we'll do more than take it," Garcia said with a predatory grin. "We're going to wrap this up with a big, red bow. I have an idea, if you're willing to play along. Let's give her enough rope to hang herself, publicly." The plan we devised was simple and elegant. Garcia's office would begin their formal investigation quietly, subpoenaing bank records to corroborate Carol's evidence. In the meantime, I was to do nothing. I was to let Brenda believe her smear campaign was working, that she had me on the ropes. We knew that, with her presidency suspended, she would make a desperate power play to get it back. We would let her call the meeting, set the stage, and walk right into our trap. There was one final piece of my own plan to put into place. The poetic justice. The detail I hadn't shared with Garcia. That night, after Mark was asleep, I went out into the cool, dark yard. I put on a pair of work gloves and retrieved a few tools from my garage. I walked over to the shallow trench I had dug for my French drain, right along the property line. With a small shovel, I located the septic cleanout access on Brenda's property, just behind the forsythia bush. It was a simple PVC cap, flush with the ground. My hands worked with the quiet efficiency of an experienced engineer. I wasn't damaging anything. I was simply redirecting. Using a series of carefully selected fittings and a length of flexible pipe, I created a temporary bypass. It was a delicate operation, requiring a precise understanding of fluid dynamics and pressure gradients. The flow from her septic tank, which should have gone to her underground leach field, was now diverted. It flowed into a perforated distribution pipe I had laid weeks ago in my drainage trench, a pipe that ran parallel to the property line for about 20 feet before taking a sharp 90-degree turn and ending directly underneath the pristine sod of her award-winning front lawn. The effect wouldn't be immediate. It would be a slow, gradual saturation, a seeping, septic poisoning from below. The evidence of my work was minimal, just a few square feet of disturbed dirt that I carefully replaced. By morning, no one would ever know I had been there. I stood up, wiping the dirt from my hands. The final piece was in place. Brenda was about to call a meeting to publicly crucify me. She had no idea she was actually sending out invitations to her own immolation. And her perfect, manicured lawn was about to become a swamp of her own making. The notice for the emergency HOA meeting arrived 2 days later, just as Detective Garcia had predicted. It was slipped under every door in the subdivision. Brenda, in a flagrant violation of her suspension, had invoked a fringe bylaw to call a meeting of the membership for the purpose of removing a disruptive homeowner. She was making her final, desperate move. She was coming for my house. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. The community center was a powder keg. It was standing room only, the air thick with anticipation and gossip. Brenda's smear campaign had divided the neighborhood. Some looked at me with open hostility, convinced I was a troublemaker. Others, the ones who had been on the receiving end of Brenda's tyranny for years, watched with a kind of hopeful excitement, as if they were waiting for a gladiator to finally slay the beast. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by 2 of her remaining loyalist board members. She looked haggard but was radiating a manic, triumphant energy. She believed this was her moment of vindication, the night she would rally the community, expel me, and reclaim her throne. She had no idea that Detective Garcia and another plainclothes officer were sitting quietly in the back row, blending in with the other homeowners. I took my seat in the front, just as before. I was calm. My work was done. All I had to do now was watch the show. "This meeting is now in session," Brenda announced, her voice ringing with false authority. She launched into a prepared speech, a 30-minute tirade that was a masterwork of projection and lies. She painted me as a dangerous deviant who had moved into their peaceful community with the sole intention of destroying it. She portrayed herself as the noble guardian of their property values, the tireless enforcer of the rules that kept their little world perfect. He has harassed me, slandered me, and created doctored videos to frame me for his own incompetence, she declared, her voice rising to a crescendo. He is a cancer in this community, and we must cut him out. I have here a petition, signed by many of you, to force the sale of his property and remove him from Willow Creek Estates for good. She held up a stack of papers from her clipboard. A few of her cronies in the audience applauded enthusiastically. She smiled, a venomous, triumphant grin. She thought she had won. She turned her gaze on me, her eyes full of hate. "Mr. Miller," she spat. "Do you have anything to say before the membership votes on your expulsion?" I stood up slowly. The room fell silent. I looked at Brenda, then let my eyes sweep across the faces of my neighbors. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I do. But before I say anything, I believe there are a couple of gentlemen in the back who have something more important to add." Detectives. On cue, Garcia and his partner stood up, flipping open their badges. "Brenda Schmidt," Garcia's voice boomed through the stunned silence. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of felony embezzlement, wire fraud, and insurance fraud." The color drained from Brenda's face. Her jaw went slack. What is this? This is a joke. He put you up to this." As the two detectives started making their way down the center aisle towards her, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. One of Brenda's neighbors, a man who lived next door to her, burst through the doors, his face pale with panic. "Brenda! There's something wrong at your house," he yelled. "The whole front yard, it smells horrible. There's stuff coming up out of the ground." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. People started pulling out their phones, looking at the live feeds from their own front door cameras. And at that exact, perfect moment, the carefully engineered septic bypass reached its full, glorious potential. The pressure underground had finally become too much. On dozens of phone screens around the room, we all watched as a geyser of foul, brown water erupted from the center of Brenda's prize-winning lawn, right next to her Yard of the Month sign. The sod, weakened from below by days of slow saturation, gave way completely. Her perfect green carpet was transformed, in an instant, into a bubbling, stinking swamp of raw sewage. The metaphor was so thick you could smell it. Which, of course, we all could, as the stench began to drift into the open doors of the community center. Brenda stared at the phone screen of the person next to her, her mind unable to process the dual catastrophes unfolding around her. The public arrest she couldn't comprehend, and the public shaming she couldn't ignore. The two pillars of her existence, her perceived power and her perfect public image, were crumbling simultaneously. That's when she broke. "It was him," she shrieked, a wild, cornered animal, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He did this. Just like he faked the video. He's a monster." Garcia reached the table. "Ma'am, you need to come with us. You have the right to remain silent." "No," she screamed, swiping at his hand. "He's the criminal. And Gary. It was Gary's idea. He told me how to hide the money. He took half of it. It wasn't just me." In her panic, she had just confessed to the conspiracy and implicated her brother-in-law in front of 50 witnesses and 2 police officers. Garcia just smiled, a thin, satisfied smile. His partner slapped the handcuffs on her wrists. The click of the metal echoed in the silent room. The public meltdown was complete. The arrest was final. Her pristine world was literally and figuratively collapsing into a pit of its own filth. As the detectives led her, sobbing and screaming, down the aisle and out of the building, she locked eyes with me one last time. "You will regret the day you ever crossed me," she shrieked, her face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief. "I will own this house. I will destroy you." I just stood there, my expression unreadable. I didn't have to say a word. I had already won. The war was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Brenda's downfall was the talk of the town. Her husband, a quiet man who had clearly been living under her thumb for decades, filed for divorce within a week. Faced with a mountain of evidence and her own public confession, Brenda took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison for embezzlement and fraud. Her brother-in-law, Gary, got 3. They were both ordered to pay restitution to the HOA, a sum totaling over $200,000. To cover her share, Brenda was forced to sell her house, the house with the ruined, biohazardous front lawn that cost a fortune to remediate. The community of Willow Creek Estates exhaled a collective sigh of relief. It was as if a toxic cloud that had hovered over the neighborhood for years had finally dissipated. The HOA was completely restructured. Carol, the whistleblower, was unanimously elected as the new president. Her first official act was to call a special meeting, not for punishment, but for progress. One by one, Brenda's most ridiculous and oppressive rules were abolished. The bylaws were rewritten to be fairer, more reasonable, and focused on genuine community well-being rather than aesthetic tyranny. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost overnight. People started talking to each other more. Kids left their basketballs in their driveways. A neighbor put up a small, tasteful, free little library on their lawn, an act that would have previously incurred a week's worth of fines. The place started to feel less like a police state and more like a home. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would stop me on my walks to thank me, to shake my hand. They saw me as the giant slayer, the men who had liberated them. But I never saw it that way. I wasn't a hero. I was just a grieving husband who wanted to protect the last piece of his wife's legacy. I had sought peace, and when it was denied to me, I had waged a methodical, calculated war to achieve it. The insurance covered the repairs to my basement. I spent weeks down there, carefully sorting through Sarah's water-damaged boxes. Some things were lost forever, but many of her photos and journals were salvageable. The process was painful, but also cathartic. It was a final, necessary step in processing my grief, a task Brenda's villainy had forced upon me, but which ultimately helped me heal. My life returned to the quiet rhythm I had originally sought. Mark was thriving in his new school, and the cloud of the CPS investigation was long gone. My relationship with my neighbors became warm and friendly. I was no longer the disruptive element, but simply Frank, the quiet engineer who lived at the end of the lane. Sometimes, in the evenings, I would sit on my back patio with a cup of coffee, just as I had on that fateful morning. I'd look at the Japanese maple, its red leaves brilliant against the setting sun. The tree was healthy, vibrant, and stronger than ever. It had weathered the storm. We both had. I thought about justice. Not the loud, vengeful kind, but the quiet, inexorable kind, like the laws of physics I worked with every day. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Brenda had pushed and pushed, applying a force of malice and control onto the world around her. In the end, the world had simply pushed back with equal and devastating force. She hadn't been defeated by some grand conspiracy or heroic act. She had been defeated by her own actions, her own greed, her own ugliness. The septic system was just a catalyst, a physical manifestation of the filth she had been pumping into the community for years. I had simply rerouted it back to its source. Peace had finally settled over 112 Arbor Lane. It was a hard-won peace, built on a foundation of data, patience, and a well-placed PVC pipe. In the quiet of my backyard, surrounded by the garden Sarah had loved, I finally felt like I was home. The silence was no longer deafening, it was calm. And in that calm, I could finally begin to build again.